They said Duke Lucien Draevor had never kneeled for anything in his life. Not for the emperor who commanded him, not for the gods men prayed to, not for the generals who begged mercy with their faces pressed into blood-soaked earth. They said his armies moved like winter itself, silent, absolute, leaving only the architecture of surrender behind. What no one said, what no one dared to whisper even in the darkest corners of the capital, was that the most feared man in the empire had been sitting alone in a palace full of people for 15 years, waiting for someone to see him clearly. Selene Vale had no idea she was about to become that someone. She just needed to survive the next 10 minutes. Up. The morning Seraphine decided to humiliate her in front of the Duke's entire household, Selene had already been awake for 4 hours. She'd risen before the palace breathed itself alive, before the kitchen fires caught, and the corridors filled with the shuffling exhaustion of servants who'd learned to keep their eyes pointed at the floor. She'd beaten Seraphine's silk dresses, pressed them with irons heated on coals, arranged her cosmetic bottles in the precise diagonal line that Lady Seraphine required. Not parallel, never parallel, diagonal, Selene, how many mornings must I correct you? And had carried the morning tray up 3 flights of stairs without spilling a single drop of the rose-hip tea that Seraphine consumed like medicine against the irritation of existing. She'd done all of this, and she'd done it correctly, and none of it mattered. "This dress," Seraphine said, not looking at her, examining her own reflection with the clinical focus of someone cataloging damage, "smells like smoke." It didn't smell like smoke. Selene had pressed it over a clean cloth, the coals banked low specifically to avoid any contamination of scent. She'd been pressing Seraphine's dresses since she was 16 years old, and she had never, in 7 years, scorched so much as a hem. "I apologize, my lady," Selene said. "I'll replace it immediately." "You'll replace it." Seraphine finally turned from the mirror, and there was something in her face that Selene recognized. Not anger exactly, but the particular appetite that preceded performance. Seraphine had an audience today. 3 of her ladies-in-waiting sat arranged on the settee by the window, their expressions arranged in careful sympathy. "You've been pressing my dresses for 7 years, and you still managed to ruin them. What exactly are you useful for, Selene?" The answer Selene didn't say. "I keep your secrets. I clean up the evidence of your cruelties. I have carried things for you that would have destroyed lesser women, and I have carried them in silence, and I will carry them until you discard me or I find a door out of this palace." Which, on the current mathematics, meant I'll carry them forever. The answer, she said, "I'll fetch the green silk, my lady." The Duke arrives this afternoon. Seraphine returned to the mirror, adjusting a curl with 2 fingers. "I want to look magnificent. Not presentable. Magnificent. Do you understand the difference?" "Yes, my lady." "I doubt that very much." She said it lightly, pleasantly, the way you'd remark on the weather. The ladies on the settee exchanged small smiles. Selene crossed to the wardrobe, lifted out the green silk with both hands, and felt nothing, or rather felt the particular kind of nothing that 7 years of practiced stillness had carved into the center of her chest. A hollow that functioned like armor. She'd built it carefully, stone by stone, learning early that the women who cried in this palace were the ones Seraphine kept. The ones she couldn't touch were the ones she tried hardest to break. Selene had decided at 16 that she would be untouchable. Not through rank or beauty or connection, she had none of those things. Through the simple, brutal discipline of not caring enough to break. It had cost her something. She wasn't certain she remembered what. Duke Lucien Draevor arrived at 3:30 in the afternoon, and the palace changed. Not dramatically, not the way the stories described it. No thunder, no shadow falling across the sun, no horses screaming. The change was quieter than that, and more total. The footmen straightened slightly. The head housekeeper, a large woman named Dara, who had survived 4 decades of imperial politics by being indispensable, moved through the east corridor with a speed that she didn't normally bother to display. The kitchen fires burned higher, suddenly urgent. Even the light seemed to adjust itself, as if the afternoon had noticed something important entering its territory and decided to stand at attention. Selene was carrying a bundle of Seraphine's rejected garments to the laundry when the Duke's carriage came through the main gate. She stopped without meaning to. She had seen Lucien Draevor 3 times in 7 years. Once at a distance during the emperor's spring banquet, when he'd been surrounded by military officers and she'd been serving wine and barely lifted her eyes. Once through a window when he'd arrived in the middle of a winter storm, his silhouette against the gray sky like something carved rather than born. And once, the time she didn't allow herself to think about, in the corridor outside Seraphine's private rooms, when she'd been carrying a tray and he'd been leaving, and they had passed close enough that she could have reached out and touched the dark fabric of his coat, and he had looked at her the way people look at furniture. Present, but irrelevant. Part of the architecture. She had told herself, after that third time, that he was simply a large and frightening man who happened to hold enormous power, that the stories about him were the natural inflation of military reputation, the way soldiers become myths because myths are easier to manage than human beings, that there was nothing singular about him. She watched his carriage pull into the courtyard and revised that opinion. He stepped down without waiting for the footman to position the step, a single controlled motion that was somehow more efficient than it should have been. Black coat, no decoration beyond the iron clasp at his throat. Dark hair cropped close at the sides, a face that had been built for cold weather and colder decisions. He was larger than she remembered, not just in height, but in the quality of his stillness, the way he occupied space without appearing to be aware that he was doing it. His military aide said something to him, and he responded without looking up from the document he was already reading, moving toward the palace entrance without breaking stride, while simultaneously dealing with at least 3 subordinates converging on him from different directions. He managed all of it with the particular efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped noticing that managing it was difficult. The thing that struck her, standing in the corridor with her arms full of silk, was how tired he looked. Not weak. Nothing about Duke Draevor suggested weakness, but behind the practiced authority, behind the ease with which he inhabited his own power, there was something worn into the lines around his eyes. The tiredness of a man who had been performing competence for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be present in a room without the weight of it. She recognized it. She felt it every morning before she remembered to put her face back on. Then he was inside, and the courtyard was just the courtyard again, and Selene went back to carrying laundry, and she told herself firmly that noticing things about the Duke of Draevor was an excellent way to get herself killed. The dinner that evening was theater. It was always theater when Seraphine entertained, but the Duke's arrival elevated the production to something genuinely impressive. The dining room had been transformed in 4 hours. Fresh flowers from the glass house, candles in silver holders, 3 additional footmen stationed at the walls in crisp new livery. Seraphine herself had spent 2 hours achieving the appearance of effortlessness, draped in the green silk that Selene had pressed for the 3rd time, her dark hair elaborately casual. Selene served the wine. This was not strictly her role. She was Seraphine's personal attendant, not a dining room servant, but Seraphine had a habit of distributing her people across different functions whenever the Duke visited, a demonstration of resources. Look how many capable people I command. Look how smoothly this household operates. Look at me. Selene moved around the table, filling glasses, keeping her eyes at an angle that let her see without being seen, and she listened because listening was the skill she had refined to something close to art. The Eastern Territories are stabilizing, Lucian said. He wasn't eating much. He had the demeanor of a man attending a dinner he hadn't chosen while simultaneously solving a problem none of the other guests were aware existed. The garrison restructuring helped. You must be exhausted, Seraphine said, with the particular warmth she deployed when she needed something. The amount of work you carry is unconscionable. The Emperor asks too much. Something crossed Lucien's face. Fast, controlled, but Selene caught it. The slight hardening around the jaw that she'd come to understand meant he was deciding whether to say the honest thing or the diplomatic thing. The Emperor asks what the Empire requires, he said, which was neither. Still, a man should have rest. Seraphine reached across the table, a gesture calculated for intimacy, and touched the back of his hand briefly. Surely even the Empire's most formidable general is permitted to breathe occasionally. The general finds his rest between campaigns, Lucien said. It's sufficient. He moved his hand, not rudely, not dramatically, simply repositioned it toward his wine glass in a motion so natural it might not have been deliberate. Seraphine's expression didn't change, but something in her posture recalibrated. Selene, pouring wine 3 feet away, noted it all with the peripheral precision she'd spent years developing. The dinner continued. Politicians said things that contained other things. Seraphine was beautiful and strategic and completely hollow at the center, which was something Selene had understood for years but could never articulate without it sounding like jealousy. She watched the Duke navigate the conversation with a patience that looked like courtesy but was probably closer to management, and she thought, he knows exactly what this is. He's been managing it for years too. He just has more power than I do, which makes his management look like confidence. She was wrong about that, she'd come to understand later. But at the time, it seemed accurate. She overheard them 3 nights later. It was not the result of cleverness or espionage. It was the result of insomnia, a habit Selene had developed sometime around year 4 of her service, her body having learned that the hours between midnight and dawn were the only truly safe hours, when Seraphine slept and the palace moved in halftime, and she could exist without the constant vigilance of performance. She'd been in the east corridor on the 2nd floor, heading back from the kitchen with the cup of chamomile she allowed herself on sleepless nights, walking quietly because she walked quietly everywhere. The lamp she carried was low. The voice she heard was also low, coming from behind the door of the small reception room that Seraphine used for private correspondence. She would have continued walking. She had trained herself over years to hear only what was necessary, to let the rest pass through her like wind through a window, because knowledge in this palace was a liability she couldn't afford. She would have walked past the door. Then she heard the name Draevor and the word assassination, and she stopped. She stood in the corridor with her cup cooling in her hands, and she listened, and her body understood what her mind was still catching up to. This was not gossip. This was not the normal poisonous currency of palace politics that she'd learned to filter and discard. This was operational, specific. Seraphine was speaking with someone she could not immediately identify, a man whose voice was careful and low, and they were discussing the wedding ceremony and what would happen during it, and the position of the Duke in the cathedral, and how the confusion of a public event could provide the necessary window. Selene's hand tightened on the cup. The chamomile had gone completely cold. She stood there for 2 minutes, possibly 3, until she'd heard enough to be absolutely certain of what she was hearing and absolutely certain that she could not unhear it. Then she turned and walked back the way she'd come. Slowly, not running because running made noise and noise made attention, and attention was the last thing she needed. And she went to her room and sat on her narrow bed in the dark and thought about what she was holding. She thought about it for a very long time. The sensible course was obvious. She knew it as clearly as she knew anything. Go to Dara, the housekeeper, who had connections to the imperial administration. Or find a way to the Duke's military aide, a serious young man named Kale who had the look of someone who actually paid attention. Or say nothing at all, which was what every instinct she'd cultivated over 7 years was screaming at her to do. Servants who got involved in the political catastrophes of their betters died with them. That was a constant in the imperial history she'd read in stolen hours in Seraphine's library. The servants were always footnotes. She lay awake until nearly dawn and could not make herself do any of those things. The honest accounting, the one she couldn't entirely articulate even to herself, was this. Lucien Draevor was not a man she was supposed to think about. He was a power structure, a function, a force that moved through the palace like weather. She was supposed to be invisible to him, and she was. And that was correct, and the appropriate thing was to stay invisible. But she had watched him for 3 days. Not with any design, simply because she was always watching. It was what she did. And she had seen the tiredness that no one else seemed to notice. She had seen him redirect conversations away from himself with the efficiency of someone who had learned very young that being known was dangerous. She had seen him sit alone in the south courtyard for 11 minutes one afternoon, completely still, and she had understood in her bones what that stillness cost. She did not tell herself she cared about him. She was not that foolish. She told herself, instead, that she had a piece of information that could prevent a catastrophe, and that she had learned enough about the architecture of power to know that letting catastrophes happen to the powerful was not actually safe for anyone below them. She told herself it was tactical. She told herself this, and mostly believed it. She found him on the second afternoon. Not by planning. She didn't have access to his schedule and wouldn't have risked intercepting it in any case. She found him by paying attention, which was different. She'd watched his habits in 3 days of proximity. The morning rounds of the estate he made before breakfast. The predictable mid-afternoon hour when his aide was elsewhere, and he used the Duke's private study on the ground floor that he'd commandeered from Seraphine's household with the quiet authority of someone who didn't need permission. She knocked on the door of the study at 2:30. Nothing happened for a moment. Then, "Come." She opened the door and stepped inside and closed it behind her, and then she stood there in front of the most dangerous man in the Empire, with her hands folded and her face arranged in the careful blankness she'd spent 7 years perfecting, and she realized she hadn't quite thought through what happened next. He was at the desk. He hadn't looked up yet. He was finishing something. A notation on the document spread before him, and for several seconds she simply stood there and he simply wrote, and the room was very quiet except for the scratch of the pen. Then he looked up. She had expected the stories. The eyes like winter, the face that had ordered executions without expression, the quality of menace that made trained soldiers recalibrate their positions in a room. She'd braced herself for the specific terror of his full attention. What she got instead was something more complicated. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the corridor 2 years ago, present, assessing. But now there was something additional in it, a question rather than a dismissal. He was trying to place her, not who she was in rank or function, but something else, like he was running a quick inventory of what kind of person he was looking at. "You're Seraphine's girl," he said, not unkindly, just accurately. "Selene Vale, Your Grace. I serve as Lady Seraphine's personal attendant. I know who you are." He set the pen down. "You're the one who's always there without being there. I've noticed." She hadn't expected that. It moved through her like cold water. The simple shock of having been seen by someone she hadn't known was looking. She kept her face still. "I need to speak with you privately, Your Grace," she said. "It concerns your safety." He looked at her for a long moment, not the look that preceded dismissal, something more careful. "Close the window," he said. "Hush." She told it flat, without drama, the way she'd rehearsed it on the walk over. What she'd heard. Where. The specific words she could recall with certainty. The voice she couldn't identify, though she could describe it. The date referenced, the wedding ceremony, 2 weeks away. The part about the cathedral positioning. She told it, and then she stopped talking and stood there with her hands folded and waited. His face didn't move. This was the thing about him she'd later understand. The control was so total that reading him required learning an entirely different register. Not the broad expressions of ordinary people, but the micro-adjustments, the thing that happened in the 3 seconds after information reached him while he was processing its implications. She caught it this time, a slight stillness, then a very small tightening around the eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation. "How long did you listen?" he asked. "Long enough to be certain of what I was hearing, Your Grace. I stopped when I knew." "And you came to me directly, not to the housekeeper. Not to my aide." "I wasn't certain who in this household I could trust," she said. "I was certain I could trust you to handle this correctly." Something shifted in his expression at that. She couldn't have named it precisely. "Why?" "Because you have the most to lose if it goes wrong," she said, "and because you're the kind of man who handles things correctly when it matters." Silence. He studied her with the focused attention of someone who was not accustomed to being surprised and was deciding how to categorize this. "You understand," he said slowly, "what position you're putting yourself in." "Yes, Your Grace. If I decide you're lying, or if I decide this is a play from someone else, you're finished. I understand that. If you're telling the truth, then Seraphine knows you were in that corridor, or she'll realize it soon enough. You've put yourself in reach of a very dangerous woman." "I was already in reach of her," Selene said. "I've been in reach of her for 7 years." Another silence. Longer this time. He looked at the window, then back at her, and she had the distinct sense he was making some kind of calculation she wasn't privy to, weighing things she couldn't see on a scale she didn't have access to. "Sit down," he said. She blinked. In 7 years of palace service, she could count on both hands the number of times she'd been invited to sit in a room with a noble. "I'm fine standing, Your Grace." "I didn't ask if you were fine," he said. Not harshly, just with the directness of someone who'd said the thing once and saw no reason to say it again. "Sit down, Selene Vale." This conversation just got longer. She sat. He asked her questions for 40 minutes. Not the questions she'd expected, not verifications of the details she'd already provided, not the cross-examination of a man looking for inconsistency. He asked her about the household, about Seraphine's relationships with the other nobles, the patterns of visitors, the names of people who came and went without announcement. He asked her about the man whose voice she'd heard, and she described it as precisely as she could. The cadence, the way the vowels sat slightly flat, the particular hesitation before the word elimination that had made her blood go cold, and watched him absorb each piece with the focused patience of someone assembling something complex. He asked her about herself once. "How did you end up in service to her?" "My father had debts," she said. "The usual story." "And you've stayed." "There are worse placements." "That's not the same as staying," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was probably wise. "No," she said. "It isn't." Something flickered. He looked away first, which was not what she'd expected. "You're going to need to not be in that household when this unravels," he said, and his voice had shifted register slightly. Less interrogation, more something else. More like he was solving a practical problem that had already been decided. "I'll arrange a transfer." "Your Grace, and not tonight. It has to look unconnected. A week, maybe less." He looked back at her, and his eyes were very direct and completely unreadable. "Stay quiet. Don't let her see you differently. You've been doing this for 7 years. You know how." She did know how. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. She stood to leave. She was at the door, her hand on the latch, when he spoke again. "Selene." She stopped, turned. "You said you were certain you could trust me to handle this correctly." He was watching her from across the room, leaned back slightly in the chair, and there was something in his face she couldn't parse. Not warmth exactly, but its distant structural relative. "What made you certain?" She thought about lying. She was good at lying, the specific kind that involved saying nothing at all. She thought about giving him the tactical answer she'd rehearsed. She stood in the doorway of his borrowed study and looked at the most feared man in the empire and told him the truth instead. "You have the same look," she said, "when you think no one is watching. You carry everything and you show nothing, and you're exhausted down to the bone. I recognized it because I have it too." She paused. "Men like that don't throw away people who bring them something real. They're too tired to waste the resource." Silence. Lucian Draevor looked at her across the width of the study, and something she couldn't name passed through his expression. Something too fast and too deep for her to catch before he controlled it, and then his face was composed again. "Dismissed," he said. Quietly. She left. She walked back through the corridor with her hands steady, and her breathing even, and her chest doing something strange and uncontrolled that she had no useful category for. She went to Seraphine's room and laid out the evening dress and said nothing. She said nothing for the next 6 days. On the 7th day, Seraphine summoned her. It was not unusual. Seraphine summoned her constantly, for purposes both necessary and invented. But the hour was wrong. Mid-morning rather than the dawn ritual, which meant Seraphine had decided she needed something specific that hadn't been anticipated. Selene smoothed her apron, adjusted her expression, and went. Seraphine was at her writing desk. She was dressed already, which was also unusual. She normally waited for Selene to assist. The letter she'd been writing had been folded before Selene entered, quickly. A small thing. Selene noted it and filed it. "I need you to deliver something," Seraphine said. "Of course, my lady." "To the Duke's chambers, the East Suite." She held out a folded envelope sealed with plain wax, no crest. "His aide will receive it. Don't speak to anyone else on the way." Selene took the envelope. She held it in both hands, watching Seraphine's face as openly as she ever did, which was to say, not very openly at all. "Is there a reply expected, my lady?" "No." Seraphine looked at her then. Really looked at her. The focused attention she normally reserved for her own reflection. There was something in it that raised the fine hairs on Selene's arms. "You've been quiet lately." "I'm always quiet, my lady." "More than usual." The assessment was continuing, steady, the way a cat watches something it isn't sure about. "You seem distracted." "Forgive me," Selene said. "I've had some difficulty sleeping." A pause. Then Seraphine smiled, the small, precise smile that Selene had learned over 7 years to fear above all others. "We all have our burdens," she said pleasantly. "Deliver that quickly and return for the afternoon fitting." "Yes, my lady." Selene left with the envelope in her hand and walked 30 feet down the corridor and stopped, her back against the wall, her heart doing something she couldn't immediately control. She looked at the plain wax seal. No crest. A message to the Duke's chambers sent through his personal attendant on a morning when nothing had been scheduled. She could not open it, not without it being visible. And it might be exactly what it appeared to be. A social communication between two nobles who had a formal relationship pending, nothing more. She thought about the voice she'd heard in the corridor, the careful syllables before the word elimination. She thought about Lucien's instructions. Stay quiet, show nothing, wait. She thought about the particular geometry of the situation she was carrying. She delivered the envelope to the Duke's aide, a young man named Kale, who took it without expression and gave no indication of anything. She returned to Seraphine's rooms and spent 2 hours at the afternoon adjusting the hem of the wedding dress by increments too small to be visible, while Seraphine stood on the platform and discussed the ceremony with her steward, and Selene breathed the particular air of a woman watching something inevitable approach. The wedding was in 9 days. She was not going to make it 9 days. The moment of unraveling came not through any dramatic discovery, but through the ordinary mechanism of routine. She was in the East Corridor, 2 days later, returning from an errand she'd been sent on, retrieving a specific book from the library that Seraphine had decided she needed immediately, which almost certainly meant Seraphine simply wanted her out of the rooms for an hour. Selene didn't analyze the reasons anymore. She went where she was sent, and she came back, and she performed the functions of an invisibility that had become so deeply habitual she sometimes forgot it was a performance. She was rounding the corner to the back stairwell when she heard her own name. She stopped. The voices were ahead of her, the other side of the bend in the corridor, close enough to be distinct. 2 voices. One she identified immediately as Mira, one of Seraphine's ladies, a woman whose primary skill was the precise reproduction of conversation she was not supposed to have heard. The other voice took her a moment longer. When she recognized it, the floor felt slightly wrong under her feet. It was Kale, the Duke's aide. "Has been seen twice in conversations with His Grace that weren't recorded in the household schedule," Mira was saying. The satisfied specificity of the sentence told Selene she'd been saving it. Seraphine noticed. She's asking questions. "The Duke conducts his own business," Kale said. His tone was careful, giving nothing. "Of course. I'm simply noting that Lady Seraphine is aware of it, and she's the kind of woman who tends to resolve her awareness with action rather than curiosity." A small pause. "If the girl has said something she shouldn't have, then that would be the Duke's concern," Kale said. "Not yours." Silence. Then Mira's footsteps, moving away. Selene stood very still against the wall, the book pressed to her chest, and calculated. Seraphine knew. Not what specifically, perhaps. If she knew precisely, the confrontation would have happened already, would have been public, would have had the particular theatrical violence that Seraphine employed when making an example. But she knew something was off. She was watching. And in Selene's 7 years of experience, the interval between Seraphine watching and Seraphine acting was never longer than footsteps. Behind her. She turned. Duke Draevor was standing at the far end of the corridor, 10 feet away, with the stillness of a man who had been there long enough to have heard at least part of the conversation around the bend. His face was its usual composition, controlled, assessing, giving nothing. But his eyes were on her, and the quality of his attention was different from anything she'd felt from him before. Not the inventory of a superior assessing a servant. Something more direct than that. More immediate. He He crossed the 10 feet between them in a few strides, stopped close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to hold his gaze, and said nothing for a moment. Around them, the corridor was empty. From somewhere below came the distant sounds of the kitchen. "She's moving faster than I expected," he said quietly. "I think she's been watching me for longer than we realized," Selene said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Your Grace." "There's no time for a clean transfer," he said. He wasn't asking for her assessment. He was stating the parameters. "That's off the table." She felt something drop in her chest. "Then, what are the current options?" He looked at her for a long moment. She watched the calculation move behind his eyes, quick and thorough, and she had the distinct sense of someone who was weighing a decision that had multiple implications he wasn't sharing. "You move to my household," he said. "Tonight, effective immediately, as my administrative aide for the duration of the pre-wedding period. That's a legitimate function. It creates a clean paper reason for the reassignment, and it removes you from Seraphine's direct reach before she can—" "She'll know it's connected," Selene said. "She'll suspect. She won't be certain, and uncertain is the only currency you have right now." His gaze was very steady. "You'll be visible in my household instead of hers, which has its own risks, but they're manageable risks. The ones you're currently carrying are not." Selene stood in the corridor with the book pressed to her chest and thought very carefully about what she was being offered. The surface of it was protection, a functional transfer, a logical solution to an immediate problem. Underneath that surface was something significantly more complicated. Moving into his household meant proximity. It meant being seen as connected to him. It meant trading Seraphine's cruelty for a different kind of exposure, a more dangerous kind, the kind that came from being useful to the most powerful man in the Empire at a moment when his enemies were actively moving against him. It meant, if she was being fully honest, stepping out of invisibility for the first time in 7 years. She'd built the hollow at the center of her chest specifically to survive without doing that. She looked at him, at the tiredness behind the composed authority, at the contained intensity of his focus, at the quality he had of making every problem feel like something that could be solved if approached with sufficient precision, and thought, this is the moment where the road branches. "When you say tonight," she said carefully, "what time exactly?" Something happened in his face, fast and small and controlled, almost a smile, if a smile were an entirely different thing. 7 o'clock, he said. "Have your belongings ready." She nodded, turned to go. "Selene." She stopped. The second time he'd stopped her at a door with her name, and the second time it moved through her like something she didn't have a word for. "When this is over," he said, and his voice was quiet and direct and completely without the performance of authority she was used to from men of his rank. "And it will be over. You're going to have options you don't currently have. I want you to understand that." She didn't turn around. She stood with her back to him in the corridor and let that sentence move through the hollow she'd spent 7 years building, and felt it find purchase in something she thought she'd successfully excavated. "Understood, Your Grace," she said. She walked away, and the book in her hands felt lighter than it had, and she made herself think about logistics. What to pack? Who would notice? How to move without drawing attention? And not about the way the corridor felt different when he wasn't in it. She spent the rest of the afternoon being extremely professional about her feelings. She was packed and ready by 6:30, which was a more accurate reflection of her state of mind than she would have liked. The room that had been her home for 7 years fit into one bag with a room to spare. This was the fact about her life that she turned over in her mind occasionally when she allowed herself the particular discomfort of honest inventory. She'd been here for 7 years and she owned almost nothing. Not because servants weren't permitted possessions, but because she'd stopped acquiring them somewhere around year 3 when she'd realized that objects were attachments and attachments were vulnerability, and she was already carrying enough vulnerability in the simple fact of her existence in this palace. She sat on the narrow bed in the lamplight and looked at the bag and thought about Seraphine, who would wake tomorrow morning expecting her and find the room empty and the explanation already written into the official household records. She thought about the particular architecture of Seraphine's fury, the cold, precise quality of it, and the ways it would now be directed toward a target it couldn't directly reach. She thought about the conversation she'd overheard 9 days ago, The voice she hadn't recognized, the specific word assassination hanging in the air of the empty corridor. She thought about a duke who had told her she would have options. At 10 minutes to 7, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Kale, the duke's aide, standing in the corridor with the expression of someone executing instructions he'd been given with precision and no personal commentary. "Miss Vale," he said, "the duke's carriage is at the east gate." She picked up her bag. She took one last look at the room. The narrow window, the pressed smooth pillow, the clean floor she'd maintained through 7 winters. The architecture of a life kept deliberately small. She walked out. The east corridor was empty at this hour, the palace having shifted into its dinner rhythm. She followed Kale through passages she'd memorized in years of errand running, past the servants' stairwell, through the garden passage, out into the blue dark of early evening, where a black carriage waited with 2 military outriders and no palace crest. She was 3 feet from the carriage door when she heard it. The sound was not large, a footstep on gravel, too deliberate to be accidental, from the shadow of the garden arch 20 feet to her left. She stopped. Kale's hand moved to his side, professional and immediate. From the shadow, a figure stepped into the faint light. Seraphine. She was in evening dress, no coat, which meant she hadn't planned this. She'd followed, quickly, which meant she'd been watching much more closely than either of them had estimated. Her face was composed, and her eyes moved from Selene to Kale, to the carriage, to the military outriders, and back to Selene with the speed of someone calculating force and weight. "Going somewhere?" she said, pleasantly. Selene stood in the gravel with her bag in her hand and felt the cold air move across her face and understood, with the absolute clarity of someone standing at the precise point where everything changes, that there was no version of this that preserved the story she'd been telling herself. She was not invisible anymore. "His Grace has arranged a transfer of my service, my lady," she said. Steady, clear. "Has he?" Seraphine's eyes moved past her to the carriage. How very convenient for him. She looked back at Selene, and the pleasantness had thinned to something underneath it that was not pleasant at all. "I wonder what you told him." The carriage door opened. Lucian Draevor stepped down. He had not been inside, or rather, he had been inside and had heard what was happening, because he moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had already decided what he was going to do before the door was open. He came to stand slightly in front of Selene, not between her and Seraphine exactly, but adjacent to her in a way that rearranged the geometry of the confrontation entirely. The military outriders straightened. He looked at Seraphine with an expression that was completely, utterly empty. "My lady," he said. Seraphine held his gaze for 3 full seconds. In the silence, Selene could hear the garden gate at the far end of the path and the distant sounds of the palace dining room and her own heartbeat, which was doing something she was trying very hard not to acknowledge. "Your Grace," Seraphine said, and her voice was smooth as glass. "You're stealing my staff." "I'm exercising my authority to reassign imperial household personnel for official functions," he said. "It's within my right." "Of course it is," she smiled. "Everything is within your right, isn't it? I've often wondered if that ever becomes—" She paused, the pause carrying the specific weight she knew how to carry. "Lonely." Something moved across Lucian's face. He said nothing. "Safe travels, Selene," Seraphine said, and turned those eyes on her one final time. The smile was still present, small and very still, and inside it was something that functioned like a promise. "I do hope the Duke's household suits you." She turned and walked back toward the garden arch. Selene watched her go. She stood in the gravel with the cold air moving through the palace garden and the carriage waiting, and the Duke standing 3 feet away. And she felt, very precisely, the sensation of having walked through a door that had now closed behind her. She was no longer Seraphine's invisible girl. Whatever she was now, it was something else entirely. She became aware that Lucien had turned to look at her. She met his gaze and held it without any of the careful performance she normally deployed for superiors. "She knows," Selene said. "She suspects," he said, "for now." How long before suspects becomes knows? He held her gaze for a moment that lasted exactly 1 beat longer than it needed to. "Get in the carriage," he said. She got in the carriage. Behind them, the lights of the palace burned against the night sky, and in one of those lit windows, she didn't look back, but she knew, a woman in evening dress was watching them go and making calculations that no one in that carriage had yet accounted for. The carriage moved. The palace fell behind them. Selene sat in the dark interior across from the Duke of Draevor, who was reading a document by lamplight, as if she weren't there and the world weren't currently shifting on its axis. And she thought about the voice she'd heard in the corridor 9 days ago. The careful pause before assassination, the flat vowels she still couldn't place, and understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has just made an irreversible decision, that she hadn't heard that voice once. She'd heard it twice. The second time had been 20 minutes ago, standing in the garden arch. The figure who'd been beside Seraphine before stepping back into shadow as she approached. The figure she hadn't seen clearly enough to identify. Selene looked at the passing darkness outside the carriage window and turned this new piece of information over in her mind like a stone, examining its edges, and came to the conclusion that she had not, in fact, overheard a conspiracy between Seraphine and an unknown collaborator. She had overheard a conspiracy between 3 people, and the third was still in the palace. She opened her mouth to say something. The carriage hit a rut in the road. The lamp swung. For 1 second, the dancing light illuminated Lucien's face from below, and she saw him. Not the composure, not the authority, not the performance, but the actual man underneath it, looking at the document with the expression of someone who already knew what it said and was reading it anyway because knowing and accepting were not the same thing. He looked up. Their eyes met in the unsteady light. "What?" he said. She had 1 second to decide whether to say it. "There were 3 of them," she said, "not 2. The carriage moved through the dark, and the lamp swung, and Selene Vale looked at her with something that was no longer composed at all, and outside the window the capital's lights began to thicken, and somewhere behind them a woman in evening dress was picking up a pen. The carriage did not stop. Lucien looked at her across the narrow interior, and the lamp swung between them, and the word 3 sat in the air like something physical. Like he could reach out and weigh it, test its edges, decide what it cost him. "Explain," he said. Not a question, not a request. The specific compression of a man who had spent 20 years extracting accurate information from people under pressure and knew exactly which word got it fastest. Selene kept her hands still in her lap. She'd had 30 seconds to organize what she knew and arrange it into the sequence that would be most useful, and she used them because the one thing she'd learned from years of navigating Seraphine's household was that information delivered badly was worse than information delivered late. "The night I overheard the conversation," she said, "I heard 2 voices. Seraphine and a man I didn't recognize. I told you that." She held his gaze. "Tonight, in the garden, there was someone standing behind Seraphine in the arch before she stepped forward. I didn't see the face clearly enough. But the voice, the way he handled a silence before stepping back, it matched. The rhythm of it." "You're certain?" "I'm certain enough to tell you. I won't claim more than that." The carriage moved through the capital's outer districts. Through the window, lamplight from the buildings threw brief orange panels across the interior, and in each flash she could see him thinking, not visibly, not with any expression she could have described to someone else, but in the quality of his stillness. The way a body thinks when the mind is moving fast. "Description," he said. "Medium height. He stayed in shadow, dark coat, I think, but I can't confirm the color. The voice, controlled. Educated, but not court-educated. Practical. The flat vowels I mentioned. Provincial. Possibly, or military." Something moved in his jaw. Fast, controlled. He looked at the document in his hands, then folded it with the precise motion of someone setting a thing aside because it had just become less important than something else. "You should have told me this in the garden," he said. "You told me to get in the carriage." He looked at her. There was a beat, brief, compressed, that held inside it something she might have called frustration if she thought he was a man who permitted himself frustration. Then he turned to the small panel on his side of the carriage and knocked twice. The carriage slowed. He didn't look at her while they waited. He looked at his own hands, folded on one knee, and she watched the controlled quality of his breathing and understood that what she'd given him was not simply additional information. She'd given him a hole in his intelligence, and men like Lucien Draevor dealt badly with holes. Not because they panicked. He wasn't panicking. He was doing the opposite of panicking. He was going very, very still. But because the hole meant someone had been closer than he'd calculated, and being underestimated by his own estimation was the kind of error he did not forgive in himself. The carriage stopped completely. Kale appeared at the window. "Go back to the palace," Lucien said. "Find out who Seraphine spoke with privately in the last hour. Don't make it visible." Kale's expression didn't change. "Yes, Your Grace." He was gone. Lucien turned back to her. The lamp had stabilized with the carriage at rest, and in the steadier light his face was clearer, harder somehow than it had been in motion. "You're good at this," he said. Not warmly, accurately. "At what?" "Observation, retention, knowing which detail matters." "I've had 7 years of practice," she said. "In Seraphine's household, missing a detail was expensive." "How expensive?" She held his gaze. "Expensive enough that I stopped missing them." The silence between them was different from the silence she was used to. With Seraphine, silence was a weapon, a space she filled with whatever implication was currently useful, shaped to produce either compliance or fear. Lucien's silence was something else. It had weight, but no direction. It was the silence of a man who had simply stopped performing and hadn't replaced the performance with anything yet. She found it more unsettling than Seraphine's hostility, and she found it unsettling that she found it unsettling. "The wedding is in 7 days," she said. "I know when the wedding is. If the third person was military, someone in your own command structure, then the security protocols you're planning around the ceremony are already compromised." He looked at her steadily. "I know that too." "Then what are you going to do?" Another beat. He studied her face the way he'd studied the document, extracting, filing, deciding what weight to assign. She didn't look away. She'd stopped looking away from difficult men somewhere around year 3 of her service, when she'd realized that looking away was an invitation. "I'm going to do what I always do," he said finally. "Find the fracture, apply pressure, watch it open." "And the wedding?" "The wedding," he said, "is going to become a different kind of event." What? The estate he was using at the capital's edge was not the primary Draevor residence. That was 3 provinces north, a fortress that functioned more as military headquarters than home. This was a working property, staffed lean, designed for operational use. Selene had expected austerity and got something closer to controlled functionality: clean lines, adequate heat, the absence of decoration that came not from poverty, but from prioritization. She was given a room on the 2nd floor. Not a servant's room, a proper guest room, small but furnished, with a window that faced the inner courtyard. A woman named Hesta, middle-aged and expressionless in the way of staff who'd learned to match their employer's register, showed her the arrangement and left without commentary. Selene stood in the center of the room with her bag at her feet and listened to the estate settle around her. Different sounds from the palace, less performance in the architecture. She didn't sleep for a long time. What? She was in the east-facing room that Lucien had designated as her workspace by 6 in the morning, which was 2 hours earlier than she'd been told to appear, because sleeping felt like a luxury she hadn't earned, and because she wanted to understand the filing system before anyone arrived to watch her struggle with it. The system turned out to be Lucien's own, organized not by date or alphabetical convention, but by some logic of adjacency and implication that she had to decode rather than read, patterns in grouping that reflected how he thought rather than how clerks were trained to categorize. It took her an hour to understand the architecture of it. Once she understood it, she found it more efficient than any conventional system she'd encountered. She was in the middle of cross-referencing 2 sets of provincial revenue reports when he walked in. He stopped just inside the door. She'd heard him in the corridor, not his footsteps exactly, but the way the air changed ahead of him, some displacement she'd learned to read without being able to explain, and had kept working because stopping what she was doing every time he entered a room was exactly the kind of adjustment she refused to make. "You're early," he said. "The system needed orientation time." He He crossed to the secondary desk and dropped a leather case on it with the particular efficiency of a man who didn't own a version of arriving gradually. You figured out the categorization. Adjacency logic. It took about an hour. Once I understood it, the groupings made sense. She looked up. You organized this yourself. My previous aide organized it the conventional way. I reorganized it. How long did it take him to relearn it? Something crossed his face. He didn't, he said. He went back to the conventional system and hoped I wouldn't check the cross-references. Did you? Always. He opened the leather case, pulled out a stack of dispatches. The Eastern Garrison reports for the last quarter are misfiled under the secondary provincial tab. They should be adjacent to the supply line correspondence, she said. I already moved them. He looked at her. She held the look. The silence lasted 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than silence normally lasted between them. Then he looked back at his dispatches. Seraphine's household reported this morning, he said. Her steward submitted a formal complaint about the reassignment. Expected. The complaint references misconduct. His tone didn't change. Unspecified. She absorbed this. Misconduct was the word Seraphine reached for when she needed a justification that couldn't be easily challenged. It was broad enough to cover anything and specific enough to imply something damaging. What will you do with it? File it, he said. Under irrelevant. She looked at him. He was reading a dispatch with the same contained focus he brought to everything, and he said that last word with such absolute neutrality that it took her a moment to recognize it as a decision rather than a dismissal. He had already decided the complaint didn't exist as a functional object, not because he was protecting her specifically, but because he'd assessed it and found it below the threshold of things that warranted his attention. And in the hierarchy of his concerns, Seraphine's formal complaint about a servant transfer sat somewhere below quarterly grain reports. She found this more reassuring than she probably should have. Cale came back at 4 this morning, Lucian said, still reading. The man in the garden was identified. Her hand stilled on the papers. Who? General Haranve. He turned a page. Commands the 2nd Division. Reports directly to the Imperial War Council. He paused. And has been drawing supplemental funds from a treasury account that officially closed 3 years ago. The shape of it clicked into place. She saw it the way she saw the filing logic, by the adjacency of the pieces, by where the gaps were and what they implied. He's not just a collaborator, she said. He's the insurance. Seraphine and the Emperor need someone to control what happens to your armies after. Vey controls the 2nd Division. If the first Duke of the Empire dies without a clear succession chain, the 2nd Division moves on the capital within 48 hours. He set the dispatch down. Standard Imperial protocol, designed to prevent power vacuums. Except if Vey's already been bought, the 2nd Division doesn't stabilize the vacuum. It creates the succession they want. Yes. She sat with this for a moment. Outside the window, the courtyard was gray with early light, and somewhere in the estate's kitchen a fire was being built for breakfast, and the ordinary sounds of a functioning household moved around the edges of the conversation like it was something normal. They're not trying to assassinate you, she said slowly. They're trying to replace you with a system they already control. You're the obstacle between the Emperor and complete dominance of the military. Lucian looked at her, not the assessing look, not the categorizing inventory of a superior evaluating a resource. Something more direct than that, and less comfortable. You got there faster than Cale did, he said. Cale isn't used to watching people from below, she said. I've been watching powerful men construct systems of control for 7 years. You learn the patterns. He held her gaze for a moment that lasted long enough to register. Then he stood, picked up the leather case, and moved toward the door. Get the provincial reports in order, he said. I need the grain shortfall numbers for the eastern 3 territories by midday. I'll have them by 10, she said. He stopped at the door. His back was to her, and she watched the set of his shoulders, the controlled tension in them, the particular quality of a man carrying a weight he'd stopped noticing because he'd been carrying it for so long. The wedding, he said without turning. I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to it. She considered this. If you don't go, they lose the window they've planned for. They'll build another one. Yes. If you do go, you walk into a prepared position. Yes. So the question, she said carefully, is whether you'd rather respond to their timeline or force them to respond to yours. A pause. He turned then, just enough to look at her over his shoulder, and his expression was something she'd seen occasionally in the weeks she'd been watching him. The look of a man who'd grown so accustomed to thinking alone that encountering another person thinking in parallel registers as something unexpected. Get the grain numbers, he said, and left. The days that followed had a quality she'd never experienced before. Not ease. Nothing in the Duke of Draevor's operational sphere was easy, and the pace at which he worked was the pace of a man who viewed rest as a tactical resource to be deployed rather than a state to be inhabited. But something adjacent to clarity. She was useful in ways that were visible, which was different from being useful in ways designed to be invisible. The filing, the cross-references, the secondary read on dispatches that she provided when asked and occasionally when not asked, all of it created a functional loop, information in, information processed, information acted on. She didn't allow herself to think too much about what it felt like to be doing work that mattered. Kyle treated her with the professional neutrality of someone who'd decided she'd been cleared and was therefore no longer a variable to evaluate. The rest of the household staff took their register from Kale. She was given appropriate space and appropriate information, and no more commentary than was operationally necessary. Lucien treated her like an extension of his own thinking, which was the most unsettling thing she'd experienced in years, and the thing she thought about least because thinking about it was a path that led somewhere she hadn't decided to go. On the fourth day, she found the second financial irregularity. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been in the provincial reports, the grain shortfall numbers she'd already provided, but was refining with supplementary data, and the pattern had surfaced the way patterns did when you'd been trained to see them. Not dramatically, not through any single revealing piece, but as a hole in the numbers where something should have been. A territorial tax collection for the Eldrin province, showing consistent shortfall for 3 years. Not unusual on its face, Eldrin had suffered drought conditions, but the shortfall had been offset in each of those 3 years by emergency supplemental allocations from the imperial treasury, and those allocations had been signed off by a clerk who, as of 18 months ago, no longer worked for the imperial administration. The clerk's last known position, financial attaché to General Selene Vale. She brought it to Lucien at 7 in the evening when he was working through correspondence at the main desk. She put the papers in front of him without preamble and stood back. He read them. He read them twice, which she'd learned meant he was constructing rather than simply absorbing. This is the funding mechanism, he said. Not a question. Eldrin's allocated shortfall relief, diverted. 3 years of it. She pointed to the relevant column. The sums aren't enormous individually. Accumulated, they cover Vay's supplemental account and then some. They've been building this for 3 years. He set the papers down. His voice was even, his jaw was not. Before the marriage was even proposed. The Emperor plans long, she said. He plans scared, Lucien said. There's a difference. Long planning is about building something. Scared planning is about eliminating someone. He looked at the papers. He's been moving pieces to eliminate me for 3 years, and the wedding is the execution mechanism, not the construction. She absorbed this. Then, if you have proof of the diverted funds, documented, provable, you have leverage before the ceremony. You don't have to wait for the execution mechanism. I have proof of financial irregularity that points toward Vay, he said. That's not the same as documented conspiracy. Then what do you need? Vay in a room, under enough pressure to confirm the chain. He looked at her. Or Seraphine. Silence. Seraphine won't break, Selene said. I've watched her for 7 years. She doesn't break. She pivots. Everyone breaks, he said. The method is the variable. She'll deny the conversation I overheard, her word against mine. Not if there's corroborating documentation. She thought about this. She thought about the letter Seraphine had sent her to deliver, said, plain wax, no crest, addressed to Kale for the Duke's chambers. She thought about the timing of it, the hour, the specific instruction not to speak to anyone on the way. She thought about whether that letter had reached Lucien and what was in it, and whether he'd already drawn the same line she was drawing. "The letter," she said. "The one she sent through me, 4 days before the transfer. Did you read it?" He held her gaze. Something in his face shifted, not surprise, the controlled acknowledgement of someone confirming a calculation. "It wasn't a communication from Seraphine, Betrayal," he said. "It was a communication to her contact inside this household, using my channels to move information past my notice." Her stomach dropped. "She used me as the courier." "Yes." "To communicate with who?" He was quiet for one beat too long. "Lucien." She used his name without the title, without the grace, and the word landed in the space between them, and neither of them pretended it hadn't. "To communicate with who?" He looked at her with the directness he reserved for things that required clarity. "The letter contained a request for confirmation of your identity," he said. "She was verifying that you were the servant she suspected of overhearing her. The contact's reply came back 2 days later. I intercepted it." She stood very still. The room was completely quiet. "She's known since before you moved me," she said. "The whole time." "Yes." "The garden wasn't an ambush. It was a confirmation." "Yes." She turned away from him. Not dramatically. She simply needed to face a direction that wasn't his face for a moment, and she faced the window and looked at the dark courtyard and felt the specific quality of understanding that arrived when you realized the geometry of your situation was different from what you'd mapped. Seraphine had known. She'd watched Selene pack her bag and deliver her to this estate with the particular satisfaction of someone who'd maneuvered a piece into exactly the position they needed it. And the contact inside Lucien's household, she turned back. Who intercepted the reply? Kale. And who was the reply addressed to inside this household? He held her gaze. She watched him weigh the decision to tell her against the decision to manage what she knew, and she watched him land on the side of telling her, which meant he'd already decided she was functional at this level, which meant everything in the last 4 days had been operating under a logic she'd only partly perceived. "It was addressed to a name I didn't recognize," he said, "a contact name, but the content gave me enough to identify the role." He paused. "Someone in this household has been reporting to Seraphine since before you arrived." The air in the room felt different, not colder, just more present, more actual. "Does Kale know?" she said. "Kale is the one person I'm certain about." "And me?" "You brought me the third name in the carriage," he said, "before you knew what it would cost you." She held it, and let it mean what it meant, and did not allow it to mean more. "I need to know who it is," she said. "In this household. The contact." "I have a strong suspicion," he said. "I need confirmation." "How?" He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, wind moved through the courtyard, and the lamp on the desk threw long shadows up the wall, and the room felt very small, suddenly. Not uncomfortably small, but with the compressed intimacy of a space where two people have stopped maintaining the distance required by their respective roles. "I need you to be seen," he said, specifically and deliberately. "I need the contact to report something to Seraphine that we control." "You want to use me as bait." "I want to use you as information," he said. "There's a difference." She almost smiled at that. She didn't. "What do you need me to do?" she said. He told her. It was clean and specific, and the risk in it was real, and she listened to all of it and understood that the moment she'd been moving toward since she stood in the corridor with cold chamomile in her hands 9 days ago had arrived. "All right," she said. He held her gaze. Something moved in his expression, too deep and too fast to name. Then he looked back at his papers with the controlled focus of a man returning himself to function. She went back to the provincial reports. The numbers were clean, the gap she'd found was documented and transferable, a piece of evidence that could end a military career if handled correctly. She worked in silence for an hour and thought about what it meant to be used deliberately, to have her visibility turned into a weapon, to step into the lit space of someone's operational plan with her eyes open. She thought about 7 years of practiced invisibility and the extraordinary smallness of the life it had produced. She thought about a bag that packed in under 10 minutes because she'd stopped accumulating things that could be taken. She thought about the way he'd said information, not bait, information. She did not examine why that distinction mattered to her as much as it did. At 9 o'clock, she set the papers down and stood and stretched her back and turned to find Lucien watching her from across the room. Not the assessment look, not the categorizing inventory, the other look, the one she had no category for. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." A beat. "I don't sleep well in the capital." "You don't sleep well anywhere," she said. "I've seen the lamp in your study at 3 in the morning. He held her gaze for a moment that lasted too long to be neutral and not long enough to be anything she knew how to name. "Good night, Selene," he said. His voice had dropped half a register without him appearing to notice. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. She walked to the door. She was in the doorway when she heard it. Not her name this time, something quieter than her name. A sound that wasn't quite a word, like he'd started to say something and caught it before it reached language. She didn't turn around. She walked to her room and closed the door and stood in the dark with her back against it and understood, with the specific and inconvenient clarity of someone who had spent 7 years being extremely disciplined about her own interior, that she had crossed a line she hadn't been watching for. Not into danger, not into politics, into something significantly harder to survive. Somewhere in the estate below her, a contact she hadn't yet identified was picking up a pen. 3 miles away, in a palace lit gold against the night sky, Seraphine was reading reports with the patient attention of a woman who'd placed all her pieces and was waiting for the board to confirm the position. The wedding was in 3 days, and in the room she'd just left, the most feared man in the empire had almost said something he'd decided not to say yet. She was in position by 8 the next morning. The plan was clean. Lucien had outlined it in 11 sentences the previous evening, the way he outlined everything. No decoration, no redundancy, just the functional bones of what needed to happen and in what order. Selene would be seen carrying a specific set of documents from the East Records room to the main study. The documents would be visible, their leather binding distinctive. She would pause in the corridor adjacent to the household staff quarters long enough for the contact to observe her and log the information. The documents she carried would contain a deliberate piece of false intelligence, a specific time and location for Lucien's departure from the capital 3 hours earlier than his actual plan. If Seraphine moved on the false timeline, they'd know the channel was live. They'd know the contact was confirmed, and Lucien would have what he needed to execute the interception before the wedding. Selene understood the plan. She understood her function within it. She walked the corridor at 8:15 with the leather-bound documents pressed to her side and her face arranged in the practiced neutrality of a woman carrying routine paperwork, and she felt, beneath the controlled surface of herself, the particular cold that came with knowing you were the visible piece in someone else's game. She had agreed to this. She'd agreed with her eyes open. That didn't make the cold go away. The corridor outside the staff quarters was empty when she reached it. She paused at the end, adjusted the documents, looked at the window that faced the courtyard below with the specific quality of someone organizing her thinking rather than surveilling the space. 14 seconds, she counted internally. Long enough to be registered without being long enough to look staged. She walked on. She didn't see anyone. She told herself that was fine. The contact didn't need to be visible. The contact needed to see her, not the other way around. By midday, the false timeline had been transmitted. Cale brought the confirmation to Lucien in 2 sentences. A rider had left the estate's north gate at 10:40 using the staff courier route. The destination was confirmed as the Palace District. The timing matched the window between Selene's corridor walk and the earliest point at which Seraphine could receive and act on the information. Lucien received this at his desk without expression and dismissed Cale with a nod. Selene was at the secondary desk, still working through the Aeldrin documentation, and she looked up when the door closed. "It worked," she said. "The channel is confirmed," he said. He was already moving, pulling the secondary ledger from the stack to his left. "The contact is—" He stopped. She watched his face. He looked at the ledger for 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than he looked at anything when he was simply reading. Then he set it down with a control that was so precise it was its own kind of violence. Hesta, he said. The woman who had shown Selene to her room on the first night, middle-aged, expressionless in the way of staff who'd learned to match their employer's register. Selene had found her professional and adequate and had not thought about her significantly since. She thought about her now. How long? Selene said. The ledger records her reassignment to this estate 4 months ago. His voice was level, completely level. The request for her transfer came through my own administrative office. I approved it. He looked at the document once more, the specific look of a man confirming something he wished he could disprove. She was placed here, Selene, before any of this started, before the wedding was formally announced. The cold in her chest relocated, settled lower. Then she didn't come to watch me, Selene said slowly. She came to watch you. Everything that moved through this estate for 4 months went to Seraphine. He stood. He walked to the window, hands at his sides, and looked at the courtyard below with the stillness of a man recalibrating. Every dispatch I received, every meeting I held, every plan I made. The Eldrin documentation, she said. You'd already started building the case against Vey before I arrived. Yes. She reported it. Yes. The shape of it was complete now, fully assembled. Every piece in the position it had always occupied even when she couldn't see it. Seraphine hadn't been reacting to Selene's arrival. She'd been watching Lucian dismantle her conspiracy from inside his own household, using a woman she'd placed there specifically for this function, and she'd let it continue because watching someone dismantle a trap was useful information about how much they knew. The false timeline, Selene said. If Hesta reported the full plan to Seraphine, she reported that we were testing the channel, he said. Yes. Then Seraphine knows we know. Yes. Which means the wedding timeline changes. She stood. They won't wait for the ceremony. If they know you're building a case and you know their position to move, they move first, he said. Tonight or tomorrow, before I can get the Eldrin documentation in front of the War Council. The room was very quiet. Selene stood in the center of it and felt the plan she'd understood collapse inward like a structure whose foundation had been removed, and she felt the cold in her chest become something more functional. Not fear exactly, but the physiological sharpening that arrived when the variables in a situation reduced to a very small number and all of them were bad. Where is Hesta now? She said. I had Kyle detain her quietly 20 minutes ago, he said. She doesn't know what we know yet. She will soon. She'll have already set a reporting schedule. When she misses it, Seraphine will know we've identified her, he said. Yes, we have approximately 3 hours before that becomes operational. 3 hours. Selene ran the math. Documentation to the War Council required a formal submission process, a minimum of 6 hours at emergency priority. Lucien's military command over his own division was unimpeachable, but Vey's control of the second created a counterforce that could be deployed on the Emperor's authority. The Emperor, who had been planning this for 3 years and had positioned every piece to ensure that when it moved faster than any response Lucian could organize. You need to leave the capital, she said. He looked at her. Not permanently, she said quickly. Tactically. If you're not here when they move, they don't have the execution target. You take the documentation with you. You reach the War Council through the northern garrison, bypassing the capital channels entirely. It adds 2 days, but it removes the window. If I leave the capital tonight, he said carefully, the Emperor interprets it as flight. The narrative becomes that I ran. I lose the political ground and the legal standing simultaneously. You lose them anyway if Vey's 2nd Division is deployed against you on imperial authority. I lose them faster if I run. She looked at him across the room and felt the specific frustration of 2 people who were both correct and both wrong, arriving at the same point from different directions. He wasn't wrong about the optics of departure. She wasn't wrong about the tactical exposure of staying. The problem was that neither calculation resolved the central equation, which was that Seraphine had 3 years and a general and the Emperor's authority and a household informant who'd been running circles inside his defenses since before any of this began. Then what? She said. Flat, real. Not asking for reassurance, asking for the actual answer. He was quiet for a moment. The courtyard light shifted outside the window, afternoon moving toward its early close, and she watched him think with the focus of a man who had reached the point in a situation where the available options had narrowed to the genuinely difficult ones and was making himself look at all of them. "I need the original letter," he said. "The one Seraphine sent through you before the transfer. I intercepted the reply. But the original letter in her handwriting with the contact name, that's direct evidence. That's the difference between a case built on financial irregularities and a case built on documented conspiracy. You don't have it. Kale couldn't retrieve it before you were moved. It's still in the palace." She understood before he finished the sentence. She felt it arrive and she looked at it directly and did not allow herself to look away. "Where in the palace?" she said. "Seraphine's private correspondence box, East Writing Room, which she keeps locked. The key is on her person during waking hours. At night, the key is in the drawer of her dressing table. Third drawer, left side." She stared at him. "You know the location of Seraphine's dressing table drawer?" "I've been conducting reconnaissance on this household for 6 months," he said. Not defensively, just accurately. She breathed out through her nose, looked at the window, looked back at him. "You want me to go back into the palace tonight and retrieve a letter from Seraphine's private correspondence box?" "I want to tell you that the letter exists and where it is," he said. "What you do with that information is your decision." That's a very careful distinction. "It's the only one I have available to me," he said, and something in his voice had changed. Not the tone, not the controlled register, but a quality underneath it. A tautness, like a man who was holding himself to a standard he found uncomfortable. "I won't ask you to go back into that household. I won't pretend the risk is manageable. If Seraphine suspects you're inside the palace, the consequences are—" "I know what the consequences are," she said. "I've been managing consequences in that palace since I was 16. This is different." "Yes," she said. "It is." She turned away from him and walked to the window and stood with her back to him and looked at the courtyard below, where the last of the afternoon light was lying flat across the stones, and she thought about 7 years of careful smallness. 7 years of building the hollow in her chest so nothing could touch it. 7 years of surviving by refusing to be visible enough to destroy. She thought about a bag that packed in 10 minutes because she'd stopped acquiring things worth taking. She thought about a man who had looked at her across a borrowed study and said, "You're the one who's always there, without being there. I've noticed." She turned back. "I need 2 hours," she said, "and I need Kale to get me through the East Service entrance without a record." Lucien looked at her for a long moment. She watched something move through him, something he controlled before it reached his face, but not before she caught the leading edge of it. A tightening. A cost. "I'll arrange it," he said. "If I'm not back by midnight—" "You'll be back by midnight," he said. Not a comfort. A statement. Like he was refusing the other possibility because acknowledging it would make it available. She almost told him that wasn't how probability worked. She didn't. Much. The palace at 10 at night was a different architecture from the palace she'd navigated for 7 years. The same corridors, the same stone floors she knew in the dark, the same specific creak on the 4th step of the servant's stairwell that she'd learned to skip without thinking. But stripped of its daytime performance, the palace had a quality she'd never fully processed while living inside it. The stillness of a place that had been built to impress rather than to shelter. The grandeur that felt slightly hollow after dark. The enormous rooms that generated cold rather than warmth. She'd lived here for 7 years and she'd never noticed how deeply uncomfortable it was. She moved through the East Wing without a lamp. She didn't need one. The route to Seraphine's private rooms was inside her body like a practiced piece of music, every turn and threshold mapped in muscle memory. She counted doors by feel, her fingers brushing the wall, and she thought about nothing but the sequence and the silence and the distance between where she was and where she needed to be. The East Writing Room was adjacent to Seraphine's bedchamber. The bedchamber door was closed. Through it came the specific quality of silence that accompanied sleep. Not absolute silence, but the settled kind, breathing-shaped. The writing room door was unlocked, which meant Seraphine hadn't anticipated intrusion. Selene filed this as either good or concerning and decided she didn't have time for the distinction. She moved to the correspondence box on the writing desk. Locked, as expected. The secondary key. Seraphine kept a secondary key for the correspondence box in the desk's top drawer, which Selene knew because she had organized that desk herself twice a month for 7 years, was where it had always been. She opened the box. The letter was on top. She took it. She held it for 1 second, feeling the weight of it, the particular lightness of a piece of paper that contained the evidence of a 3-year conspiracy to commit murder. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it inside her jacket, and closed the correspondence box. She turned. The lamp on the side table had not been lit when she entered. It was lit now. Seraphine sat in the chair beside it. She was in her evening robe, her dark hair loose, and she looked at Selene with the expression she'd had in the garden. The small, still smile that wasn't warm and wasn't hostile, but was something more precise than either. The expression of a woman who had arranged things correctly and was watching them arrive at their arranged position. "I thought it might be tonight," Seraphine said pleasantly. "I wasn't certain, but I thought." Selene stood in the center of the room and did not move. She ran the available options in the same flat second she'd spent running political calculations for weeks, and the available options were run, which required getting past Seraphine and through the outer door before she could call the guards; negotiate, which required currency she didn't currently have; or stand and think faster than the situation. She stood. "The letter," Seraphine said, the same pleasant tone. "You found it." "I found it," Selene agreed. "I left it there for you to find," Seraphine said. "That particular letter. The others are elsewhere." She tilted her head slightly. "The Duke sent you. He thinks that letter is the evidence he needs. Isn't it?" "It's a letter in my handwriting confirming a financial arrangement with a household contact," Seraphine said. "Nothing in it references the Duke by name. Nothing in it references the wedding. It's suggestive, certainly, but suggestive is not what the War Council requires." She smiled. "I've been in this palace for a long time, Selene. I know what evidence looks like." The cold in Selene's chest had become something different now, something that wasn't cold at all but its direct opposite, a heat at the center of her thinking, clarifying and sharp. "What do you want?" she said. "I want you to deliver the letter," Seraphine said. "I want you to take it back to Lucien exactly as planned. I want him to believe he has what he needs." She paused. "I want him to use it, to present it to the War Council, to build his case on it, to commit to the timeline it implies. And then I want him to discover, in front of the full council, that the document proves nothing. You want to destroy his credibility before the wedding." "I want to destroy his ability to act before the wedding," Seraphine said. "A duke who presents fabricated or insufficient evidence to the War Council loses standing, rapidly, permanently. By the time the ceremony happens, he'll have no political ground from which to object." She looked at Selene with the focused assessment she normally reserved for her own reflection. "You'll deliver the letter, he'll use it, and this will be over." Selene held her gaze. She thought about the Eldrin documentation, the real documentation, 3 years of diverted funds, the clerk who'd transferred to Vey's office, the supplemental treasury account. She'd spent 4 days refining those numbers. They were in the estate's records room. They were real, provable, the kind of evidence that didn't require a letter in anyone's handwriting. Seraphine didn't know about them. She'd reported the plan to intercept Seraphine's communication channel. She'd reported the false timeline operation. She hadn't been present when Selene found the Eldrin numbers. That had been a private afternoon, a pattern surfaced from provincial data, brought directly to Lucien without passing through any channel Hesta could have accessed. Seraphine had 3 years of intelligence from inside Lucien's household, and none of it included the one thing that could actually end her. Selene looked at the woman who had shaped 7 years of her life through cruelty so practiced it had become structural, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but the specific and clarifying sensation of a door opening where she'd thought there was only wall. "All right," she said. Seraphine smiled. "Good girl." The words landed the way they always had, designed to diminish, to reduce, to remind her of what she was and wasn't. For 7 years, those words had functioned correctly. They'd found the hollow in her chest and confirmed it. They didn't find it now. Selene picked up the letter and walked out of the writing room and through the corridor and down the servants' stairwell and out the east service entrance into the cold night air. And she walked the 3 miles back to the estate without a carriage because she needed the time to think. And by the time she arrived, her face was numb from the cold, and she knew exactly what she was going to tell Lucien. Not everything Seraphine had said. Just the part that mattered. Just the part that confirmed what she'd suspected since that afternoon with the provincial reports. That the real weapon in this fight had never been a letter in a correspondence box. It had been the numbers. She walked through the estate's east door and Cale was there, and she looked at him and said, "I need to see him, now." Lucien was awake. The lamp in his study burned at midnight, and he was at the desk, not working, which meant he'd been waiting. He looked up when she came through the door, and something in his face, controlled, contained, and underneath the control the specific quality of a man who had spent the last 2 hours making himself not think about a particular possibility, resolved into something she couldn't name because naming it felt like a risk she hadn't calculated yet. She put the letter on the desk. She said, "Seraphine was waiting for me." She watched his face. She said, "The letter is real, and it's not enough. She left it for us to find. She wants you to use it." She watched him understand. She watched the calculation move through him, cold and fast. She said, "But she doesn't know about Eldrin. She's never known. And Eldrin is enough." He looked at the letter on his desk. He looked at her face. He looked at the letter again with the expression of a man standing at the precise point where everything he'd built his strategy on had just collapsed and something else had landed in its place. Not better, not worse, but completely different from what he'd expected. "You let her think you were delivering it as she intended," he said. "Yes." "She'll move on that assumption. She'll tell Vey the letter is in play." "Yes." "Which means when we move on the Eldrin documentation instead, she won't have time to adjust." "That's the idea," Selene said. He was quiet for a long moment. The lamp threw its steady light across the desk and the papers and the letter that was both evidence and trap. And outside the window, the Capitol sat in its dark bulk of stone and politics and 3 years of patient conspiracy. And somewhere in the palace, Seraphine was sitting in her chair with her hands folded and the satisfied certainty of a woman who had placed the last piece correctly. "She called you a good girl," Lucien said. Selene blinked. "How did you—" "Because it's what she does," he said, "when she thinks she's won." He stood. He looked at her across the desk with something that was not composed, not managed, not the controlled authority she had learned to read as his default register. Something underneath all of that, older than strategy, more immediate than calculation. "The War Council convenes at 7, he said. "We have 6 hours." He picked up the Eldrin documentation from the secondary stack, and Selene understood, standing in that lamplight with the cold of the night still in her jacket and the weight of everything she'd walked through still in her body, that the plan they'd been running for 2 weeks was over, that what came next was not a plan at all, but a war, and that the difference between where she stood now and where she'd stood 9 days ago in a corridor with cold chamomile in her hands was the difference between a door and the open ground beyond it. There was no wall left, only the choice of which direction to walk. They worked through the night, not side by side exactly. Lucien at the main desk, Selene at the secondary. The Eldrin documentation spread between them like a battlefield map. 6 hours to assemble what 3 years of careful corruption had constructed, to find the seams in it, to pull the threads in the sequence that would cause the whole structure to collapse rather than simply fray. Cale moved in and out of the room with dispatches and verification documents, his footsteps the only sound besides the scratch of pen on paper and the occasional low exchange when they needed to confirm a figure or clarify a chain of authorization. The lamp burned down twice. Selene replaced it without being asked. At 3 a.m, Lucien pushed back from the desk and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose, and she watched him do it. The small, unguarded gesture of a man who had pushed past exhaustion into the particular territory beyond it, where the body stops complaining because complaining requires energy it no longer has. She'd been in that territory for 2 hours. She recognized the quality of it. "The Vey connection needs a third document," she said. The first two establish the funding mechanism and the diversion timeline, but the War Council will want a direct link between the Ealdrin account and Vay's operational spending, not just the clerk transfer. I know, he said. The third document is in the Northern Garrison financial records. Kale's rider is already moving. Will it arrive in time? It'll arrive. He said it the way he said things he'd already decided were true. Not optimism. Something harder than optimism. The refusal to let a variable remain unresolved when it could be forced into resolution by will. She looked at him across the desk. In the lamp's low light, he looked stripped down, not diminished, but reduced to the functional essentials of himself. The performance gone. The authority still present, but not performed, just structural. The way a wall's load-bearing quality isn't something it does, but something it is. She thought about the first time she'd seen him in the corridor and thought, he is tired down to the bone. She hadn't understood then that the tiredness wasn't weakness. It was the specific exhaustion of a person who had been carrying the full weight of their own nature for a very long time without help. She looked back at the documents. If the Council accepts the case, she said, Vay loses his command. The 2nd Division reverts to standard imperial oversight. The Emperor loses his execution mechanism. Yes. And Seraphine loses her protection. Yes. She'll move before the Council convenes, Selene said. She's expecting us to use the letter. When she wakes up this morning and starts calculating, she'll know something's wrong by 6, he said, when Hesta doesn't make contact. 5, Selene said. Hesta runs a morning schedule. Seraphine will expect confirmation by 5 that the letter is in play. He looked at her. You know her schedule. 7 years, Selene said. Something crossed his face, not quite what she'd call guilt, because she didn't think he was a man who processed guilt as a distinct emotion, but a compression of it, a brief accounting. Then it was gone, and he was back in the documents, and she let it go because there wasn't time to hold it. The writer arrived at 4:40 with the Northern Garrison records. The third document was there. Clean, specific, Vay's operational account drawing from a source that traced back to the Ealdrin diversion through 2 intermediary transactions. It wasn't elegant. Corruption rarely was when you pulled it into the light. But it was complete. A chain of authorization from the diverted provincial funds to Vay's supplemental account to a specific set of payments logged as operational security expenses that had no corresponding operational activity on record. Lucian read it once, set it down. We go at 7, he said. The War Council chamber was on the palace's 3rd floor, in the administrative wing that operated on a separate security protocol from the residential sections. Lucian arrived at 6:50 with Kale, the documentation in a sealed case, and Selene. The last part was not in the plan. She'd understood she would wait at the estate. She'd understood her function in this phase was complete. She'd retrieved the letter. She'd identified the trap in it. She'd provided the critical intelligence about the Ealdrin documentation. What happened in the council chamber was his domain, his standing, his arena. She'd understood all of this, and she was in the carriage anyway. He hadn't said anything when she came down the stairs behind Kyle. He'd looked at her for 2 seconds, and then looked away, and she'd taken that as neither objection nor invitation, simply as the acknowledgement of a man who'd run out of the energy required to manage her choices as well as his own. She walked into the palace she'd left in the dark 6 hours earlier and felt it differently under her feet. The council chamber held 12 seats. 7 were occupied when they arrived. 3 military generals of varying rank and alliance, 2 administrative lords whose function was procedural, and in the center chair, with the specific alertness of a man who had not slept and had been waiting, Emperor Caius. He was smaller than she'd expected, not physically. He was of average height, well-built, the body of a man who'd maintained a soldier's regimen past the age when most emperors softened. But the presence was smaller. She'd built him in her mind from 7 years of second-hand accounts into something monolithic, and what she saw was a man in his middle 50s with clever eyes and the controlled expression of someone who had learned to keep the anxiety off his face but hadn't managed to keep it out of his hands, which were folded on the table with a precision that was its own kind of tension. Vay was not present. She filed this. Lucienne, she knew, had filed it 60 seconds before she did. "Your Grace," the Emperor said. His voice was smooth, well-practiced. "This is irregular." "I have irregular business," Lucienne said. He crossed to the table and set the sealed case on it. "The Council is convened. I'm invoking emergency standing under the Third Military Charter." "On what basis?" "Documented conspiracy against the military command of the Empire," Lucian said. He opened the case. "With evidence." The chamber was very quiet. She watched the Emperor's hands. They didn't move. That was the tell. Not reaction, but the absolute suppression of it. A man who is surprised controls his face. A man who is not surprised controls everything. He'd known they were coming. The thought arrived fully formed, and she looked at Cale and saw from the set of his shoulders that he'd reached the same point 3 seconds ahead of her. The question wasn't whether the Emperor knew. He knew. The question was how and when, and what he'd arranged in the hours since he'd known. The door at the chamber's far end opened. General Heron Vey walked in. He was in full military dress, which was wrong. The council convened in administrative protocol, not military ceremony. The dress was a statement. It said, "I am here in my official capacity, and that capacity is armed." He was followed by 4 officers whose positioning was not the positioning of an honor guard, but of something more functional. Lucienne did not turn around. "General Vey," he said, still facing the Emperor, "you're late." "I was detained," Vey said. His voice was what she'd heard in the corridor. Flat vowels, controlled cadence. The voice of a man who'd learned precision as a survival mechanism in environments where imprecision was fatal. "By a matter requiring my personal attention." "The matter of your financial records?" Lucian said. Silence. "Which I have here," Lucian continued, and his voice had not changed in register or volume, but something in it had become very clean, stripped of everything except the factual, the way a blade is stripped of everything except its edge. 3 years of documented diversion from the Ealdrin Provincial Relief Allocation. An intermediary account in the name of a clerk who subsequently transferred to your office. Operational spending logs that don't correspond to any recorded operational activity. He finally turned. He looked at Vey the way he looked at problems, completely, without performance. "Do you want to explain it to the council, or should I?" Vey looked at him. The 4 officers behind him held their positions. The chamber held its breath. "The documentation is fabricated," Vey said. "Flat, clean, practiced. I'll say so to the council, and I'll say so to the Emperor. The Duke has been under increasing pressure, the upcoming marriage, the transition of command authority, and he's constructed a case against a loyal general to distract from his own failures of allegiance." "His failures of allegiance," the Emperor said, from the center chair, with the specific tone of a man reading from a prepared text. "His refusal to submit to imperial authority," Vey said. "His unauthorized reassignment of imperial household staff. His harboring of a servant who has been conducting unauthorized surveillance of palace communications." The last sentence landed in the room and she felt it. The specific impact of being named in a space where being named made you a variable, an object, a piece in someone else's argument. She held still. She kept her face exactly where it needed to be. Lucian turned his head. Not to look at her. To make visible to everyone in the room that he was choosing not to look at her, which was its own communication. He turned back to Vey and the Emperor and said, with the absolute evenness of a man who had spent 20 years making decisions under fire and had learned that the decisions made in the first 5 seconds of crisis were the ones that set the trajectory of everything that followed. The documentation has chain of custody established through the Northern Garrison's Independent Financial Audit Office, which reports to the War Council, not to the Imperial Administration. The intermediary clerk is currently in custody at the Garrison's administrative detention. He has already provided a preliminary statement. He set one additional document on the table. This is it. The room shifted. She felt it, not dramatically, not with sound, but in the quality of attention in those 12 seats, the way a calculation changes when a new variable lands. Vey's hands moved. A small thing, a half-inch adjustment of his right hand toward his side, and the 4 officers behind him read it, and she watched them read it, and she thought, This is where it goes. Lucien. She said it without thinking, not loudly, just his name from where she stood by the chamber wall. He was already moving. He moved the way he'd stepped down from the carriage on the first day. A single controlled motion, efficient beyond what should have been possible. And he was between Vey and the council table before the officers behind Vey had completed their adjustment. Not attacking, positioning. He stood between the table and the general with his back straight and his hands at his sides and his voice completely level. "If those men draw weapons in the Imperial Council chamber," he said, "they will be executed for treason against the state. The Emperor's authority to protect this chamber is absolute, so is mine, as First Duke of the Empire, to invoke it." He looked at the Emperor. The Emperor looked at him. Selene watched the Emperor's hand still folded on the table, and she watched the calculation move across his face. The specific calculation of a man who had planned carefully and was discovering that careful planning had a failure mode, which was that the person you'd planned against was also capable of careful planning, and the question now was not who had the better plan, but who was willing to go further. She had thought, watching him from the periphery for 7 years, that the Emperor's defining quality was patience. She'd been wrong. His defining quality was calculation. He was, at his core, a man who made decisions based on what was survivable and what wasn't, and he was running that calculation right now with his hands folded on the table and his face composed. "Stand down," the Emperor said. It took her a moment to understand he was speaking to Vey. Vey's jaw tightened. The 4 officers behind him froze. "Your Majesty?" "Stand down, General." The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Then Vey's hand moved back to his side. The officers settled. The chamber exhaled without making a sound. Lucien did not move from his position. "The documentation will be reviewed," the Emperor said. His voice was still smooth, still practiced. She could hear the recalibration in it, the pivot from a plan that had just become unexecutable to the next available position. "A full inquiry will be opened. General Vey will be suspended from command pending investigation. The 2nd Division command passes to General Adric in the interim," Lucien said. Not a suggestion. A pause. "Agreed." She watched Vey's face in the moment the Emperor agreed. She watched him understand what had just happened. Not the loss of the gambit, but the specific quality of the loss, which was that the man he'd been paid to help destroy had just outmaneuvered him in front of witnesses without raising his voice. And the Emperor had folded in 30 seconds because the Emperor's calculation had landed on survivable, and survivable did not currently include Haran Vey. She'd seen Seraphine make that same calculation before, standing in the garden arch in the dark. She recognized its specific texture. Vey looked at Lucien. Something in his face abandoned the practiced control and showed something rawer underneath. "You think this is over?" he said. "I think this particular mechanism is over," Lucien said. "Yes." "The Emperor will make another decision, given time and different circumstances," Lucien said. "That's a problem for another day. Today's problem is resolved." He looked at Vey with the complete, unadorned attention he gave to things that required clarity. "You should have stayed out of palace politics, General. You were good at war." Vey said nothing. He turned and walked out of the chamber, and the 4 officers followed him, and the door closed. The chamber held its quality of held breath for another moment. Then one of the administrative lords cleared his throat, and the procedural machinery of the council resumed, the way institutional machinery always resumed, because it was designed to survive the humans operating within it. Selene looked at Lucien's back. She looked at the line of his shoulders, the controlled tension in them that had not released because the chamber wasn't clear yet, wouldn't be clear for hours. And she thought about a man who carried everything and showed nothing and was exhausted down to the bone. And she thought about the night they'd just come through, 6 hours of documentation and lamplight and 2 people working in parallel, and she let herself feel for exactly 3 seconds the thing she'd been not feeling since the carriage. Then she put it somewhere useful and looked at the door. The palace corridors moved differently after the council session. Not quietly, there was nothing quiet about a suspended general and 4 officers making their way through the administrative wing, but with a different current, the specific agitation of a political environment registering a seismic shift. She watched it move through the footmen and the administrative clerks and the household staff she passed, the way news moved through stone by vibration rather than direct transmission. She was in the east corridor, moving toward the exit where Cale was waiting with the carriage, when she heard the footstep. She turned. The corridor was empty in both directions. She stood for a moment, listening, and the palace was all its usual sounds: the distant kitchen, the administrative wing's low hum, the wind through the upper gallery. She walked on. She was almost at the end of the corridor when the door to her left opened. The room it opened into was a small antechamber. Servants' access, rarely used during administration hours. She'd passed it 10,000 times in 7 years without looking at it specifically. Seraphine stood in the doorway. She was dressed for the day, composed, her dark hair pinned, her expression the same smooth readiness she wore for political encounters. She looked at Selene with the eyes of a woman who had made her calculation and landed on the side of action. "The council session," she said. "How did it go?" Not a question. A test. She already knew. "The documentation was accepted," Selene said. "Vale is suspended. The 2nd Division command has transferred." Something moved across Seraphine's face. Not the small, precise smile, not the composed pleasantness, but something underneath both of those, older and less managed. She looked at Selene the way she'd looked at her in the garden and in the writing room and in 7 years of morning routines. And for the first time, Selene saw in that look not cruelty exactly, but what cruelty had grown from: a woman who had lived her entire life in a system that rewarded strategic ruthlessness over every other quality, and had become very, very good at the only thing the system valued, and had never once been seen as anything other than a piece in someone else's calculation. She recognized that too. She didn't let it move her. Recognizing something's origin doesn't obligate you to absorb its impact. "You're going to tell me I've made an enemy," Selene said. "You already had an enemy," Seraphine said. "Now you have a more committed one." She tilted her head slightly. "He'll protect you for a while you're useful, while the novelty of a servant who thinks holds his interest." The words came out with the practiced evenness of someone who had learned to make wounds look like observations. "Then the Empire will require something from him that you can't provide, and he'll make the calculation that men like him always make." "Maybe," Selene said. Seraphine blinked. She'd expected denial or anger or the specific flinch of someone who'd been handed a fear they were already carrying. "Maybe," Selene said again, "but that's a problem for another day. Today's problem is that your general is suspended, your emperor just retreated, and the mechanism you spent 3 years building is broken." She held Seraphine's gaze with the steadiness she'd spent 7 years building into herself, and she felt it differently than she'd ever felt it. Not as armor, not as hollow, but as something structural, something load-bearing. "Whatever he does or doesn't do later, I'm not standing in your corridor anymore. I'm not arranging your dresses and carrying your letters and pretending not to hear what you say when you think invisible people can't matter." She paused. "I matter. I've mattered the entire time. You just didn't look hard enough to see it." Seraphine stood in the doorway and looked at her, and for a fraction of a second, underneath everything she'd built and everything she'd become, something genuinely human crossed her face. Not remorse, not guilt. Something more complicated than both. The expression of a person who has encountered a truth they didn't construct and doesn't know what to do with it. Then it was gone. "Enjoy it while it lasts," Seraphine said quietly, and closed the door. Selene stood in the corridor and breathed and didn't allow her hands to shake until she'd counted to 5. Then she walked to the exit, and the morning light came through the end of the corridor hard and direct, and she walked into it. Lucien was at the carriage. Not inside it, standing beside it, coat open, looking at the palace facade with the expression he had when he was thinking about something he hadn't resolved yet. Cale was 15 feet away, professionally elsewhere. The courtyard was quiet in the specific way that followed large events. The noise that would come later was gathering itself, but it hadn't arrived yet. She crossed the courtyard and stopped beside him and looked at the palace too, and they stood there in the cold morning air, not speaking for a moment that lasted longer than most moments she'd experienced with him. The kind of silence that had weight because of what it contained rather than what it didn't. "The Emperor will recover," she said. "He'll build another mechanism." Yes, he said. Seraphine will adjust. Yes. So this isn't over. No, he said. It's not. She looked at the palace facade, the stone and the height of it, the flags moving slow in the cold wind, the architecture of centuries of power that had never once considered whether the people living inside it were actually surviving or simply enduring. She thought about 7 years of endurance and what it had cost and what it had preserved and whether those were the same thing. What happens now? She said. He turned from the palace and looked at her. The morning light was direct and unsparing, and in it he looked exactly like himself. The tiredness still there, the contained force still there. And underneath both of those something she'd been carefully not naming for 2 weeks, because naming it changed the geometry of everything. The wedding, he said. In 3 days. The Emperor will insist on it proceeding. It's the last public mechanism he has, the appearance of alliance, of control, of a duke who is still contained within imperial authority. He held her gaze. If I attend, I walk into a prepared environment with a compromised host and a hostile emperor and no clear security perimeter. And if you don't attend, she said, we covered this. The calculus changed this morning, he said. The council session, the documentation, the suspension of Vale, that's public record now. The emperor's position is weaker than it was yesterday, which makes him more dangerous, not less. Cornered men, she said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The wedding isn't the ceremony anymore. It's the last open ground before he has to make a different kind of decision about me. About us. He said the word without emphasis, without the performance of what it implied, just as the accurate pronoun for the two people standing in this courtyard and the situation they'd built together. If I go, I control the terms of that ground. I arrive on my terms. I make visible what I choose to make visible, and I take away his ability to define the narrative before I can. Lucien, that's insane. It's the move he won't anticipate, he said. He's expecting flight or legal challenge. He's not expecting me to walk through the front door of his ceremonial event in front of the entire imperial court. She stared at him. She thought about all the moments in the past 2 weeks where she'd watched him make decisions that were technically correct and humanly bewildering. She thought about a man who'd spent 20 years winning by being the one person in any given situation willing to do the thing that everyone else had calculated as impossible. She thought about the specific quality of his face right now, the tiredness and the force and the underneath thing she'd been not naming, and she understood that the decision had already been made and what he was doing wasn't asking for her assessment. He was telling her because she'd earned the right to know. Then I'm going with you, she said. Something moved through him, fast and deep and completely controlled except that she was close enough and had been watching him long enough to catch it. That's not... You walked into a room and stood between the council table and an armed general, she said. You don't get to tell me what's too dangerous. I'm the first Duke of the Empire, he said. Walking into that ceremony is calculated risk. Walking you in beside me changes what they're looking at, she said, which changes what they're prepared for. She held his gaze. You said I was information. That's still true. The courtyard was very quiet. The flags moved slow in the cold air. Somewhere above them, the palace held its 700 rooms of politics and history and careful architecture. And in 3 days, it would hold the event that everything had been building toward. And standing in the morning light in the open ground of the courtyard, she felt, for the first time in her life, that she was not managing the distance between herself and what was coming. She was choosing to walk toward it. Lucien looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the corridor on the second day. And in the study when she'd told him she recognized his tiredness. And in the carriage when she'd said there were 3 of them, and his composure had fractured for exactly 1 second before he controlled it back. He looked at her like she was something he didn't have a category for, and had stopped trying to build one. 3 days, he said. 3 days, she said. He opened the carriage door. Inside the palace, behind one of those 700 windows, a man in his middle 50s with clever eyes and folded hands was picking up a pen. In the administrative wing, the suspension order was being drafted and the council's preliminary findings were being sealed, and the machinery of consequence was moving in the direction that consequences always moved once they'd been set in motion. In the residential wing, a woman with dark hair and the composed face of someone who had not yet finished calculating was standing at her window, looking at the courtyard below. Selene stepped up into the carriage. The palace door above opened. A footman appeared at the top of the entrance stairs, moving fast, with the specific gait of someone carrying an urgent communication. He called out, not to Selene, not to Kyle, to Lucien, still standing beside the carriage door. "Your Grace!" His voice carried across the courtyard with the quality of something that had been rehearsed. "The Emperor requests your immediate presence in the private throne room. He says," a pause, the pause of someone delivering the exact wording they'd been given, "it is not a request." The courtyard went silent. Lucien's hand was still on the open carriage door. He stood completely still for 3 seconds, and she watched the calculation move through him, and she watched it arrive somewhere, and she watched his face in the moment it arrived. The specific expression of a man who has just understood that the next step is not 3 days away. It is right now. He looked at her. She looked at him. Lucien closed the carriage door. Not away from her. Toward what was coming. He turned to face the footman on the stairs, and the morning light fell across him hard and direct, and Selene watched him make the decision in the space between one breath and the next. The specific decision of a man who had run out of the option to wait. "Tell the Emperor I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said. The footman retreated. Lucien turned back to the carriage, and his eyes found hers through the open window, and he held that for exactly 1 second, not long enough to be anything she could name, long enough to be everything she already knew. And then he looked at Kyle. "Stay with her," he said. "Lucien," she started. 10 minutes, he said. "If I'm not back in 30, you leave the capital. You take the northern road." He held her gaze with the directness that had always been his most honest quality. That's not negotiable. She wanted to tell him everything that was wrong with that instruction. She wanted to tell him that she had not survived 7 years in that palace by letting other people walk into its danger on her behalf. She wanted to tell him that the particular cold settling into her chest right now was not something she was willing to manage from the safety of a carriage. She said, 20 minutes. Something moved in his face. Not quite the almost smile. Closer to it than she'd ever seen. 15, he said. He walked up the palace stairs without looking back, and the door closed behind him, and the courtyard returned to the ordinary sounds of a morning that didn't know what it contained. She lasted 12 minutes. Cale didn't try to stop her. He was either too professional to attempt it, or had already understood that attempting it would be a waste of both their time. He fell into step 6 feet behind her as she went up the stairs and through the entrance hall and into the administrative corridor that led to the private throne room, and she was grateful for the 6 feet because it meant he understood the distinction between accompaniment and escort. The private throne room was not the ceremonial hall. It was smaller, older, the room that existed before the Empire had decided it needed grand architecture to make its power legible. Stone walls, high windows, a chair on a low dais that had been sat in by 8 emperors. The room where actual decisions were made rather than performed. The doors were closed. She could hear voices through them, not the words, the quality. One voice measured and controlled, one voice that had not started controlled and was working to stay that way. Lucien's voice was the second one. She had never in 2 weeks heard Duke of Draevor lose the control of his register. Not once, through documentation and betrayal and a council chamber full of armed men and a general who'd moved his hand toward a weapon. The control had seemed absolute, structural, something he'd built so deeply into himself that accessing what was underneath it would have required demolishing the building. She stood outside the door and heard his voice on the other side and understood that the building was under different pressure now. Not physical. The other kind. The kind that got through the foundations. She opened the door. The Emperor stood at the window. He was not in ceremonial dress. He was in mourning clothes, which was wrong in the way that Vay's military dress had been wrong. Not an error, but a communication. He turned when the door opened and looked at her with the eyes of a man encountering an unexpected variable and deciding what category it occupied. Lucien stood in the center of the room. He was very still. The kind of still that followed movement, that held movement inside it like a body of water holds everything thrown into it. On the low table between them was a document. Imperial seal, formal header, the specific weight of paper that was used for instruments of state. She crossed the room to where she could read it. Dissolution of military command. Effective immediately. Duke Lucien Draevor, first Duke of the Empire, relieved of all military authority pending full imperial review of the council session's findings and counterclaims. She looked at the Emperor. The documentation I presented to the council this morning was verified through independent channels, Lucien said. His voice was even. She could hear under the evenness what it was costing him to keep it there. The counterclaim of fabrication cannot be sustained. The council's verification process takes 90 days, the Emperor said pleasantly, during which time military command at the first Duke's level requires active imperial confidence, which I am withdrawing. He looked at the document on the table. It's entirely legal, Your Grace. You know that. It's the last mechanism you have, Lucien said. Vey is suspended. The financial documentation is in the council's hands. You can't move against me directly without the political cost becoming unsurvivable. So you strip the command, create a 90-day vacuum, and use the vacuum. Oh, he paused. How long do you think the vacuum holds before someone fills it in a direction you don't control? Longer than it takes to have a wedding, the Emperor said, and signed certain instruments of inheritance that make the transition of military authority considerably cleaner. He tilted his head slightly. You see, Your Grace, you've been thinking about this as a conflict to win. I've been thinking about it as a structure to outlast. He smiled, and it was the oldest kind of smile, the kind that came from a man who had been alive long enough to watch impatient people exhaust themselves against patient ones. Sign the dissolution, attend the wedding. In 90 days, when the review concludes, and it will conclude in your favor, I have no interest in a false finding. Command is restored and we proceed. Everyone survives. And Seraphine, Lucien said, is my instrument, the Emperor said simply, as she has always been. She conspired to have me killed. She conspired to manage a political problem that had become structural, the Emperor said. The method was extreme. The intent was institutional. He spread his hands slightly, a gesture of reasonableness that had been rehearsed so many times it had lost its awareness of being rehearsal. This is how empires function, Your Grace. You know this. You've been part of this function for 20 years. She watched Lucien's face. She watched him hear the Emperor's logic, the cold, frictionless logic of a system that had been running longer than any individual within it, and had learned to absorb challenges by reframing them as components. She watched him hear it, and she watched him recognize it, because he'd been operating inside that logic for his entire adult life, and some part of him had built his identity from being the part of the machine that worked correctly. She watched him decide whether that was still true. The silence lasted a long time. Outside the high windows, the capital moved in its ordinary morning rhythm, and the empire sat in its vast weight of provinces and armies and grain allocations and political debts, and the room held the specific stillness of a moment that was about to become permanent, regardless of what happened next. No, Lucien said. The Emperor's expression didn't change. Your Grace, no, Lucien said again. The word was quiet and completely final. I've been part of this function for 20 years. I've held territories, managed transitions, absorbed the costs of this institution's failures, and presented them as my own competence so the institution could continue to function. I've done that because I believed the function was worth the cost. He looked at the Emperor with the complete stripped attention he reserved for things that required absolute clarity. The function is not worth this cost. You're willing to lose your command over... The Emperor glanced at Selene, and the glance carried the specific dismissal of a man who had categorized her and moved on. This. I'm willing to lose my command, Lucien said, over myself. The room was very quiet. Selene stood beside the low table and felt the words move through her. Not the words directed at her, the words directed at a man in a chair who had built an empire on the assumption that everything had a price and everyone would eventually pay it. She felt them land in the hollow she'd spent 7 years constructing and felt the hollow change shape, not fill. She wasn't foolish enough to believe that wounds filled cleanly, but change, become something structural rather than simply empty. The Emperor looked at Lucien for a long moment. She watched him run the calculation one more time, the assets, the liabilities, the available moves and their projected consequences, and she watched him arrive at the place where calculations always arrived when the person across the table had stopped being predictable. He picked up the dissolution document. He folded it. He set it back on the table. "Get out of my palace," he said. His voice was still smooth. It would always be smooth. That was the thing about men like him. They wore their losses as composure because composure was the only currency that never fully devalued. "Both of you. Today." Lucien looked at him for one more second. Then he turned. He didn't look at the document on the table. He didn't look at the chair on the dais or the imperial seal or the high windows with their view of the capital that had been the axis of his professional life for 2 decades. He looked at Selene and the look said, "Let's go." She walked beside him out of the room. Bombed. The packing took 40 minutes. Not because there was much to pack. Lucien traveled operationally and owned less than she'd expected from a man of his rank, his possessions organized with the same adjacency logic as his filing system, everything positioned for function rather than display. She handled the documents, the case, the secondary correspondence files. He handled the rest. Cale coordinated the carriages. They didn't speak while they packed. There was a quality to the silence that wasn't the working silence of the past 2 weeks. It was more open than that, less bounded by the architecture of their respective functions. She was aware of him in the room, the way she'd been aware of him since the carriage on the first night, but the awareness had changed register, less like watching a storm from behind glass and more like standing in the same weather. She was wrapping the Eldrin documentation in its protective folder when he stopped beside her. She looked up. "You opened the throne room door," he said. "Yes." "I told you to stay in the carriage." "You told me 15 minutes, she said. It had been 12. A pause. Something in his face moved, the almost smile, and then past it into the actual thing, which was smaller than she'd imagined and more real. Not the performance of warmth, but warmth itself, surfacing through 20 years of practiced absence like a spring through stone. "We're going north," he said. "The primary estate. It's going to be—" He paused, choosing the word with the care he gave to things that mattered. "Different from what you're used to." "I'm used to a narrow bed and 7 years of other people's choices," she said. "Different sounds manageable." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the case. "Good," he said. They left the capital in the early afternoon. 3 carriages, lean complement of staff, the northern road opening ahead of them into the clean cold of the provincial countryside. She sat across from him and watched the capital's silhouette diminish through the rear window and felt it go without the grief she'd anticipated. 7 years of her life in those stones, 7 years of silence and endurance and the careful maintenance of her own survival. She'd expected to feel the weight of leaving it. She felt lighter. He was reading, because he was always reading, documents from the case spread across his knee, and she watched him from the corner of her vision and thought about what he'd said in the throne room. Not to her. To a man who had assumed that 20 years of institutional loyalty was a more powerful constraint than the thing underneath it. She thought about what it had cost him to say it. Not in political terms, not in the calculation of assets and liabilities, but in the interior terms of a man who had built his identity around the function and had just looked at the function clearly for the first time and found it insufficient. She knew something about that. The discovery that the structure you'd built to survive was not the same thing as a life. "Lucien," she said. He looked up from the documents. "The Emperor will recover," she said. "He'll build another approach. The 90-day review will find technicalities. The wedding will happen with someone more manageable. In 6 months, a year, whatever it takes." "Yes," he said. "So this morning wasn't an ending." "No," he said. "It was a beginning." He held her gaze. "They're the same thing usually. Endings and beginnings, the same moment, 2 different directions." She looked at him, at the tiredness that was still there, and probably always would be, at the force that ran underneath it like a current under ice, at the things she'd been not naming for 2 weeks that he hadn't named either. And she thought, we are two people who built ourselves for survival in systems that didn't care whether we survived, and we have both just walked out of those systems, and the ground on the other side is completely unmapped. She thought about the hollow in her chest, the careful smallness of her life, the bag that packed in 10 minutes. I don't know how to do this, she said. Not the politics, not the strategy, tsama, the other thing. The thing that didn't have a name yet but occupied the space between them with the specific gravity of something real. He set the documents down. Neither do I, he said. And the honesty in it was the most undefended thing she'd heard from him, more undefended than the throne room, more undefended than the almost smile or the lamp at 3 a.m, or any of the small accumulations of the past 2 weeks. I've been managing everything for so long, I'm not certain I know the difference between managing and living anymore. You know the difference, she said. That's why you said no. He looked at her. You could have signed it, she said. The calculation was survivable. The Emperor's logic was internally consistent. 90 days, a wedding, restoration of command. The machine continues. You've been part of that machine for 20 years, and you know exactly how to stay part of it. She held his gaze. But you looked at what staying required, and you decided the cost was yourself. That's not management, that's the other thing. The carriage moved through open countryside now, the city fully behind them, the road running north between bare-treed hills and the hard gray sky of early winter. Inside, the lamp swung gently with the carriage's motion, and in the moving light his face was the most visible she'd ever seen it, all the layers present at once, the authority and the tiredness and the controlled force, and underneath all of it, the man who'd been sitting alone in rooms full of people for 15 years, waiting without knowing he was waiting. I spent 20 years, he said quietly, learning what I was capable of, what I could control, what I could build and hold and defend. I got very good at it. A pause. I got so good at it that I forgot it was supposed to be a means, not a destination. What changed, she said, though she knew. Someone walked into my borrowed study, he said, and told me she recognized my tiredness, and I understood that being recognized by someone who had no reason to lie about it was worth more than everything I'd spent 20 years building. He looked at her with the completeness he gave to things that required it. I've been trying to figure out what to do with that understanding ever since. She held his gaze and let the words settle and did not perform composure or manage the distance between herself and what she was feeling, because she'd decided in a corridor at midnight with cold chamomile in her hands that the hollow wasn't armor, it was just absence, and absence wasn't the same as strength. You could start, she said, by stopping treating it like a problem to solve. The almost smile again, and passed it. I'll work on it, he said, but the primary estate sat 3 days north of the capital, in a valley between 2 ridge lines, stone walls and working courtyards, and the kind of scale that came from centuries of functional use rather than imperial display. It was cold when they arrived, the late afternoon sky pressing down hard and close, the staff who came out to meet them moving with the efficient warmth of people who'd been waiting for their duke's return and were relieved to have it. She stood in the main courtyard and looked at the buildings and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she needed a moment to identify it. She felt like she was somewhere she was allowed to be, not belonging. That was too large a word for a first afternoon in a strange place, but allowed, present, without condition. Existing in a space that wasn't demanding her invisibility as the price of her continuation. Lucien stood beside her. He looked at the estate with the eyes of a man coming back to something he'd been away from for too long, and she watched him breathe differently. Slower, the specific quality of a body releasing something it had been holding without knowing it was holding it. It needs work, he said. I haven't been here in 8 months. The North Wing has a drainage problem that I keep not resolving. Then resolve it, she said. I will, he said. Eventually. Now, she said. Resolve things now, while you have time. He looked at her sideways, not the assessment look, the other one. Is that a general philosophy or a specific instruction? Both, she said. He looked at the estate for a moment longer. Then he looked at her. The afternoon light was low and direct, and it found the lines of his face honestly, everything there, the wear of 20 years, and the force and the tiredness and the thing underneath all of it that had no name yet but was present, structural, load-bearing. "Selene," he said. "Yes," she said. Before he said anything else. Before the next sentence, whatever it was going to be. Yes to the estate and the north wing and the drainage problem. Yes to the unmapped ground and the two people standing in it who didn't know how to do this and were going to do it anyway. Yes to the specific weight of a future that hadn't been calculated or managed or arranged, but had arrived the way real things arrived. Through a door she hadn't been watching, in a corridor, at midnight, with cold chamomile in her hands. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Come inside. I'll show you where the library is." She walked beside him through the courtyard and through the main doors into the warmth of the estate, and outside the cold pressed down and the empire sat in its vast complicated weight 3 days south, and it would require attention, sooner rather than later. The review, the emperor's recovery, whatever Seraphine was building in the silence of her repositioning, all of it still present, still moving, still the territory in which they lived. None of that had resolved. Real things rarely resolved cleanly. But resolution, she was understanding, was not the same as conclusion. Resolution was the decision to stop being managed by what had happened and start being shaped by what you chose. It was smaller than triumph and quieter than victory, and it lasted longer than either. He showed her the library. It was large, poorly organized, and faced east with windows that would catch the morning light. She stood in it and looked at the shelves and felt the first quiet she'd experienced in 2 weeks settle around her shoulders like something earned. "It needs organizing," he said from the doorway. "Yes," she said. "It does." "Are you going to tell me how?" She looked at the shelves for a moment longer. She thought about adjacency logic. She thought about a filing system organized by the architecture of how a mind moved, rather than how clerks were trained to categorize. She thought about two people who had spent their respective lives building systems to survive, and what it might look like to build something else instead. "Probably," she said. "Give me a few days." She heard him make a sound behind her, not quite a laugh, the sound that lived next to one. And she turned, and he was in the doorway with his coat still on, and the tiredness still in his face, and the force still underneath it. And he was looking at her the way he'd been looking at her since a borrowed study and a door, and the first honest thing she'd said to a powerful man in 7 years. "Take your time," he said. She held his gaze across the library and thought, this is what it costs. Not the throne room, not the council chamber, not the 3 days of documentation and strategy and a letter that was a trap. Those were manageable. Those were the work. Those were the territory both of them had navigated their whole lives. The cost was this: standing still in a room with someone who saw you clearly and choosing not to manage the distance. Choosing presence over protection. Choosing the unmapped ground over the hollow. She had built herself to survive. This, she was beginning to understand, was what surviving was for. "All right," she said. Outside the library windows, the last of the afternoon light moved across the valley floor, and the ridge lines held the cold sky, and the estate settled into its evening sounds. And 3 days south, the empire continued its enormous, complicated motion, indifferent and demanding and permanent. And in a library that needed organizing, in an estate with a drainage problem, in the first quiet she'd earned in 7 years, Selene Vale looked at the shelves and began to think about where to start.